went in-house as part of the executive team at Airbnb, where I helped oversee the efforts to quote-unquote legitimize the business across 100,000 different markets around the world. When we started, there wasn't a single legal framework really in the world. By the time I left a couple of weeks ago, there were over 80% of our top markets had legal frameworks in them. So I think some lessons from that for this space. Also mainstreaming, something that was thought of as sort of a niche space back in 2015, is today a noun and a verb. And so I oversaw the communications and the policy work and worked with an incredible team there, incredible founders.
I'm recording this podcast from an Airbnb in Miami.
I was almost going to ask if you're actually in a great Airbnb in Miami. And I hope it's treating you well. That's great to see.
It gets the job done.
That's good. That's excellent. And at the end of 2021, Katie Hahn, who had launched with Chris Dixon one of the early VC verticals in crypto, and who herself had come out of a government background, a prosecutor, reached out to me and said she was thinking of launching her own fund. We sort of thought of it as, she described it as almost VC 3.0, a different sort of model, or the next generation of a model for a venture capital fund, thinking of it more as a venture contributor fund, or values contributor fund, sorry. And she shared her vision with me. I told her it was one of the best calls I'd gotten all year. And anyone who knows Katie knows that when you get a call, you're going to end by saying yes. And so formally joined the fund about a month ago, maybe a little longer, as the chief strategy officer. And it's been like jumping on the proverbial rocket ship. So really excited to be with both of you today and having this conversation. So thanks for having me.
So last month, we saw that the administration published its long-awaited executive order on crypto. And that was a real milestone because it finally means the government will try to put forward a coherent strategy for regulation. However, simultaneously, you've got things like the Securities and Exchange Commission Chair, Gary Gensler, and the Commodities Futures Commission Trading Chair kind of jockeying for position and wanting to both bring crypto under their purview. We have people like Senator Elizabeth Warren on what Politico called an anti-crypto crusade. So at this moment in time, how would you kind of grade crypto companies and other crypto lobbying or advocacy groups on their efforts in Washington? In what areas do you think they're doing well? Where do you think they're failing? How do you think they could improve?
Sitting here in Washington, I'm about half a mile from the White House. Crypto came out of nowhere as a pay for in an infrastructure bill. So really, although there are some people in this town who know cryptocurrency stone cold, including in the government, not just technologists, from a lobbying perspective and an advocacy perspective, it came out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, people had to get up to speed, people who know Washington, and I would put myself in this category. I'd probably put Chris in this category, Web 2 people. And I have thoughts on how we talk about Web 3 and the language around it. But people who know this town had to learn the substance and the tech really quickly and get involved to help push back on some, frankly, sudden and poorly thought out provisions in a bill, a must-pass bill. So I think one of the things the industry has done really well is bring in a bunch of talent quickly. And so there are much better spokespeople and use cases. Maybe not F minus, maybe F. But really I think the storytelling needs a lot of work to make it compelling to people who are in Washington who have a very specific constituency, right? 435 members of the House of Representatives, they only care about the 761,000 people in their district. And I don't hear a lot of the right stories resonating with that crowd. Maybe an F is harsh, but I'm going to stick to that as my grade.
You got to be careful if you take Professor Nikki's class. She's going to definitely be a rigorous grader. Happy to jump in. So, in many respects, you always refer to things through your own sort of experiences. So bear with me on this. It does feel to me a little bit like, and this will tell you how old I am. I am, it's a firm, people call me the crypto dad. So I am the crypto dad. Sometimes I like to think I'm the cool crypto uncle if I'm really good. But 2001 that I referenced earlier, when, the big name brand today, many of them FANGs, really began interacting with Washington, D.C., had a similar feel. Even when I joined Airbnb in 2015, and there was, almost every day massive coverage and conversations about the so-called sharing economy, that feels a little bit similar to me. But I think the difference is that compared to those two periods, this is even bigger and moving even faster. Those were either 2001, tech was not quite yet the actual economy, right? It was a part of the economy. Today it is the economy. And, even in 2014, 15, when the sharing economy was emerging, it was still more sectoral as opposed to thinking about the entire architecture of the internet and by extension, the economy, and even if you want to think about society and how society is organized. And so I have really three core takeaways to your specific question. I think, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that executive order, what we in Washington, or those in Washington, would call the EO, it's a pretty significant moment, given the fact that it is the White House under a president planting a flag that the U.S. does want to lead on crypto/Web3. And that executive order identified three things that are potentially challenges, right? How we think about financial instability, how we think about quote unquote illicit transactions, how we think about consumer protection, but it also really emphasized some three incredible value propositions. The idea that the U.S. should be leading on innovation, the competition and competitiveness piece for the United States, the economic inclusion piece. And so you do have the president really planting the flag. And even given the way DC works, and Nikki was smart to address this, that you've had up to this point in time various agencies, including the SEC, trying to lead on this. This was really the White House saying, the White House is going to lead on this. And so, and we can go deeper here if you want, but it does remind me a little bit of 1996, before the Clinton administration really worked with Congress on the 96, what eventually became the Telecom Act, which created the legal structure for today's internet. There was a report done through the White House by a White House aide by the name of Ira Magaziner. And Ira started off a process that ultimately was a version of an EO, where the Clinton White House really embraced what the internet could represent for the future and took it in a very different direction ultimately. So I do see some parallels to that. I think, secondly, the political clay here is really still very soft. What I am really struck by is that, both parties, are ultimately, I believe, open to the value proposition of what this can represent. Now, I think it's incumbent upon, this space, this movement, to really articulate that, communicate that, and demonstrate that. And I think that really is speaking to the point Nikki was making about the actual language, the story, the framing, how we talk about this, how we communicate about this. And then the third piece, I would say, and I think to me this is, at least from my perspective, the most important and meaningful, which is, both Nikki and I have been in politics for way too long. We both have our scars from it. And anyone and everyone who's in politics always talks about the fact that, they're part of a movement. Very rarely is there, in fact, an actual real movement underneath that. Sometimes it's grass tops, sometimes it's words only. It tends to have a little bit of a cotton candy feel to it. This is, in fact, an actual movement. And it's a movement because of the social value proposition that is represented by it. And it appeals to people both on the left and the right, often for the same desired outputs, maybe coming at it from a little bit of different philosophical perspectives to enter into it. But to me, the next 4 or 5 months, really through the midterms, it is absolutely critical for this space, for lack of a better way to describe it, to demonstrate in a way that's meaningful to elected officials that there is a crypto voter out there who matters. At the end of the day, my grand theory of the case, and I'm not suggesting I'm necessarily right, but it is certainly how I've operated, is politics drives policy that drives regulations. And that politics is foundational to it. And in the same way that a publicly traded company is evaluated by shareholders as to whether it's making money at the level that it's priced at, politicians care whether or not they're going to be elected or reelected. And because there is such a significant movement, I mean, polling shows 1 in 10 voters, hold crypto. Those voters are going to vote on this issue. So there are, at some level, single issue voters, and they're significant in number. If they can demonstrate their voice over the next 4 or 5 months through the midterms, I think that then begins to sort of solidify that political clay in a bipartisan or maybe even pre-partisan way, and sets up the politics going forward. And so that, to me, is absolutely critical as we think through the midterms and look forward.
So, but at this moment in time, obviously, some of what you said was kind of looking forward. But right now, what grade would you give?
You're going to hold me to that grade.
I am.
I benefited. I have to say, I benefited from having the opportunity to think about it as Nikki was answering that question. So I will give the proverbial duck. I'm pretty blunt, but I would give the proverbial duck on this. I think it's an incomplete. I think we're still in the course, and I think that course plays itself over the next semester.
Oh my gosh!
Nikki,
No.
Nikki is rolling her eyes at me.
I'm rolling my eyes.
At this point in time,
it's an incomplete. You're not.
He's
even
a
through the
master
semester.
communicator. He's a master communicator. He's not going to grade his own clients.
So my kids go to these schools in San Francisco, the Bay Area. They give them rubrics, before you actually get your grade. So our rubric would be like, you're doing well here. You need to make more progress here. So it's
then
incomplete.
So give me what are one thing that they're doing well with and one thing that they need improvement on then.
I think what they're doing well with is substantively engaging with what I would call sort of mid-level policy makers, on the Hill and the various agencies in genuine, thoughtful, substantive conversations, as well as with sort of some of the civil society entities, who are all part of the broader echo chamber. Where I think we need to do much better on is, ultimately the people who are going to be making the decisions here are those people whose names are on the ballot or whose party is on the ballot in some form or fashion. And those folks knowing that this is an issue that will have a direct impact on whether they're elected or reelected.
Okay. So there's another thing that I've been wondering about. There's this whole plethora now of crypto lobbying and or Washington education groups. And this isn't even a complete list. Coin Center, Blockchain Association, Crypto Council for Innovation, HODL PAC, Chamber of Digital Commerce, DeFi Education Fund, Web3 Forward, GMI PAC. There's others. Obviously, A16Z, has its own kind of powerhouse of former regulators. I'm sure Han Ventures is kind of going the same route. What's your sense of whether or not it's helpful or hurtful to have so many groups? There's 2 on the list where, one of them clearly was born out of the fact that some of the members were unhappy with what happened in that group. The Blockchain Association allowed Binance in, and then Coinbase ended up leaving and launched the Crypto Council for Innovation. So, what's your sense of whether or not having so many groups means that they end up working at cross purposes, or is it that they're complementary, or what's your sense of that? And this might even relate to Nikki's storytelling point. So I'm throwing a lot out there, but yeah, what's your opinion about all that?
So full disclosure, I just recently signed on with the Crypto Council for Innovation, which has a new executive director, Sheila Warren. And so, check me on my grade for storytelling with that group in a couple of months. But I think that so I'm just disclosing that because you had asked about some of the politics between the groups. I actually think this is I hear a lot of the groups saying the same thing. So when the EO came out, you could just look at the statements from the different leads and they were all almost identical, which I don't think is a bad thing necessarily. I think from a policy perspective, a rising tide lifts all ships, right? So if really there's a lot of alignment, I know there's proof of stake and proof of work, and people might have slight differences, but in general, the industry is looking for a set of rules and regulations that are clear so that they can move forward with building their businesses, getting their investments done, helping move capital in a way that doesn't get, essentially written down by a regulation they didn't expect. So I think from a policy perspective, everyone is trying to row in the same direction. I think that having a bunch of different spokespeople in a perfect world, you see like the different industries, the MPAA, right? Hollywood, they have one association. Tech, which I've worked in for years and years, we used to really just have one, the Internet Association, which is now gone. And there are splintered groups with the industry and a circular firing squad. So I think that the number of groups is not really problematic as long as everyone, again, is rowing in the same direction, even if they come at things from a slightly different angle. A bigger concern would be if they start aiming at each other and in a way that is unhelpful overall to the industry. And I don't really you see it a little bit, but when it comes to how they're interacting with the agencies, I don't see a ton of that. So maybe that's a little bit of a dodge, but I think you can be more effective if you have one giant trade association for an entire industry, but that's just not how this is. And it's not even how tech is anymore.
Yeah, I come out of the Democratic Party, which, could generously or charitably be described as a mosaic on its best days, and the beauty of the mosaic coming together. And I do think, if you think about Web3, and you do think it is what the future architecture of the internet is going to look like, and as we talked earlier, the economy, then it is by definition going to be a mosaic. I do think, and I agree with Nikki, that various entities did I think a really great job in and around the EO, in speaking with a consistent, forward-looking voice on that. I think that is a signal or a function of the space, and those who are engaged in policy and speaking on behalf of it, really becoming increasingly more sophisticated in terms of how they're engaging and talking about these issues. Still a lot of work to be done, but I do think that was a pretty powerful sign of it. And I guess to mix my metaphors here, if you think of this as a symphony, there's different instruments that can play different sounds, and they all come together. And I do think that is probably consistent with the nature of the space. And what I have been struck by, and both of you have been, Nikki, a little bit longer than me, Laura, you've been in it much longer, but what I am consistently struck by, whether talking with founders, whether the folks who are involved in policy on this, is that there is generally a shared ethos in terms of excitement for something that is going to be less centralized, for something that's going to be trust-based and open and transparent and accessible, that allows for people to participate in their own economics in a fundamentally different way. And so I do think that ethos just does course through all of this. And I do think that actually helps bring folks together. Again, people are going to come at it with some of their own philosophical perspectives, but I do think generally some of those thematics are, tend to be, very much the consensus within the space.
Yeah, it's not clear yet if they've gotten all the lawmakers on board with that idea. But speaking of kind of relationships with lawmakers, I do often see tweets by crypto executives or even sometimes former regulators who now work in crypto, lobbyists, and other people in the industry, where they will tweet things and they'll even tag somebody, especially people who are kind of anti-crypto, such as Gary Gensler or Senator Elizabeth Warren. And in those tweets, they will be calling them names or mocking them. And then thousands of people will like and retweet these tweets. And I could just imagine it leads, the notifications of, Gensler and Warren to fill up with these tweets that basically make fun of them or are downright hostile to them. What do you think of that strategy?
First of all, I think some of this is somewhat just a derivative of how social media works. And ultimately, what your goal is as someone who's on social media, if you're trying to generate as many likes as possible, go viral, there's certain ways you can do that that may be really constructive for what you're trying to build in terms of a following, but not necessarily always the most constructive thing in terms of the actual discourse, particularly when you think of who some of those targets may be. In some ways, when you engage that way, it's actually only helping them with their politics, right? Anytime you go into negotiation or conversation, this is certainly the case with an elected official or someone who's a high-level political appointee, like what is it that they're trying to solve for? Who is their constituencies? Who do they care about? And yes, you can preach to your own choir and your own base, but in some ways that actually may then be counterproductive because it positions them with their audience in a way that just sort of reinforces everyone going to their separate corners. I did a tweet yesterday at the SEC and at Gensler. I began it by saying respectfully, and then the thread was basically in response to the SEC had said that they wanted to ask 4 questions about crypto, and I thought those 4 questions basically presupposed the answers. And if you looked at the 4 questions they were asking, it was basically taking the 3 challenging elements of the executive order: the illicit transactions, the stability. if they're in a safe district, for the most part, goes back and does these town halls. And in addition to tweeting out, if you actually showed up at one of these town halls and just asked a question about where member A, B, or C stands on crypto and Web3, 5 or 10 people showing up at each of those town halls will in and of itself dramatically shift the politics on this. Because every member will then come back from their August recess, they'll all talk amongst themselves, and they will have seen that there are people who are literally voting with their feet, to, version of the African proverb, to show up at these town halls and express themselves. And because there is a real movement, that should be something that folks can do and would have a huge impact. So I do hope that folks think about that, because I do think that that is a way to demonstrate that there are people who really care about this in a way that actually is meaningful to those elected officials.
I think, Chris, talking tactics is really smart because, and this is, I don't want to seem like overly that I've been observing Chris's career from afar for a while, but when he joined Airbnb, so again, I'm in DC, almost overnight, if I stepped foot near the Capitol complex, I would get a targeted ad featuring a host, an Airbnb host who lived in Southeast DC or Anacostia, explaining how, and home sharing in DC especially, this was a market that was really hostile and remains somewhat hostile to Airbnb. You'd get an ad of someone saying, I'm making money by renting out an extra bedroom or a basement apartment. So it was the right messengers, the right message, and it was so strategic. I mean, it was, you could see it was geofenced in this town. Like you'd walk, you'd step, you'd get the ad. So it was a really effective campaign, Chris. I mean, and I remember observing it and being like, damn, this is good. This is really good. And I think at Uber, when I was at Uber, we did things which I would also encourage these companies to think about. If you don't want to go to a town hall in person, which a lot of people who are active in crypto are very online, we would just put into the app their legislator's phone number. Reach out to your member of Congress and just get that sort of grassroots movement contacting them directly. So instead of spending time on Twitter, I think you can think tactically, to Chris's point about activating the politics behind it. And if you are going to speak directly to electeds using online tools, take a page out of the Airbnb playbook, which was really effective.
All right, so this has been so fascinating. We are going to talk in a little bit about the number of pro-crypto regulators who have moved into the industry. But first, a quick word from the sponsors who make this show possible. Building the next big thing in crypto? Cross River has your back. Whether you are a crypto exchange, NFT marketplace, or wallet, Cross River's integrated API-based platform provides the payments solutions you need to grow. Cross River is powering the future of financial services. A CryptoFin Industry Award winner and an early partner for companies like Coinbase, Cross River's tech stack supports crypto partners and enables real-time money movement for consumers. Welcome to a new world of crypto-friendly banking. Request your fiat on-off-ramp solution now at crossriver.com/crypto. Finance is changing. Strategies are changing. Holding is changing. Beefy Finance, the multi-chain yield optimizer, allows you to maximize passive income while you sleep. Simply deposit your crypto into Beefy's secure, industry-leading auto-compounding vaults to put your funds to work. Each one of Beefy's 740 vaults automatically reinvests the interest gained on your crypto deposits, earning you more while saving you time and fees. Beefy's strategies create bank-busting APYs with 0% deposit fees at the click of a button. Join $1.4 billion of investments and understand why so many users trust Beefy with their financial independence. Visit beefy.finance and take control of your financial future. Join over 10 million people using Crypto.com, the easiest place to buy, earn, and spend over 150 cryptocurrencies. New users enjoy 0 credit card fees on crypto purchases in their first 30 days. With Crypto.com Earn, you can get industry-leading interest rates of up to 8.5% on over 40 coins, including Bitcoin, and earn up to 14% on stablecoins. With the Crypto.com Visa card, you can spend your crypto anywhere. Enjoy up to 8% cash back instantly, plus 100% rebates for your Netflix, Spotify, and Amazon Prime subscriptions, and 0 annual fees. Download the Crypto.com app and get $25 with the code LAURA. Link in the description. It's becoming clear that utility is the future of NFT technology. And no launch platform does utility better than Galaxis. Anyone with a community can now engage with, reward, and monetize their following by issuing an NFT collection with dynamic utility traits. These traits can be customized to the needs of a particular community and change over time, allowing the creator to sustain a prolonged relationship with their most valuable followers. Visit galaxis.xyz to learn more. Back to my conversation with Nikki and Chris. There's been somewhat of a mass exodus, I would say, of pro-crypto regulators who have gone to industry. We've seen former SEC Chairman Jay Clayton, Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, Trump OCC Chief Brian Brooks, Trump CFTC Chair Christopher Giancarlo, former CFTC Commissioner Brian Quintenz, Obama's ambassador to China, and former Senator Max Baucus. There's so many. And what's your sense of whether or not this just kind of leaves behind all the anti-crypto regulators, or in general, like what is the relationship that regulators tend to have with their former colleagues who have gone to industry? Can those people be effective once they are on the outside?
I don't know that I would describe the people in the buildings in Washington, Treasury, SEC, when you're thinking of the staff, as anti-crypto. I actually think that there's a lot of benefit in having financial regulations in general, set aside crypto. Financial regulations in general are incredibly complicated. Other than healthcare and transportation, it's the most regulated industry we have. So having people who really understand how the staff works, what they need to see, what the rules are. This is a jurisdictional gray area, which is going to take some expertise. I don't think there's a downside. I think it's fine for people to have been public servants and then go into the private sector and take that expertise and help get the strategy right. But I think you're right that some of these funds are stacked like cordwood with former regulators. But I think there's plenty of people left in the buildings, and it'll actually help connect the tissue between the funds, especially who have people and people at these companies, and who's left in the buildings. But there are plenty of staffers still left who are going to need to learn and get up to speed, and they'll be able to speak the same language.
So obviously, as we mentioned before, this is an election year, and we are seeing a number of congressional candidates that are taking up pro-crypto stances, and they're generating new donations for themselves as a result. But watching this, I do remember that in the 2018 midterms, the left was kind of jazzed up about trying to counter President Trump, and they kind of donated to a lot of candidates, but then the people in those districts didn't actually vote for them. And so it was sort of this conception of like outsiders trying to influence these elections. So I wondered, in this case where we are seeing crypto people trying to support these different congressional candidates, does that just backfire because it makes it feel like outsiders are trying to have this undue influence in the local district? Or do you feel that every dollar or Bitcoin or Ether or whatever matters no matter where it comes from?
Nikki, you want to jump in, and I'll go after you. You and I this may be the place you and I may diverge a little bit, but this will be an interesting conversation, part of this conversation.
I have a feeling we may diverge. And by the way, Chris is the only one of us who has worked for someone who actually got elected president. So I've seen, obviously, there's a lot of people who are Bitcoiners running for, or not just, that's sort of a nomenclature for a few of the candidates, but crypto enthusiasts running for office. And you are now starting to see PACs stood up to give to these candidates. But we know 90% of incumbents are reelected. So I would think very carefully before I would write a check to someone challenging an incumbent. I think it might be a better use of money to write a check to an incumbent and get your message and get your moment in front of that person to make your case. Because we just know that's just the way politics is. The incumbents almost always win. And if you endorse an opponent, you're going to potentially create an enemy. So in general, try to give to the incumbent if you can, unless it's a race that's up for grabs. I think that Chris made a really good point about if there are people who are one-issue voters, getting that message out. And money is necessary in politics. So I think it's fine to give money. I think it's a really good way to make sure your message gets out there and make sure that people are hearing it. But I would be really thoughtful about endorsing so-called crypto enthusiasts over someone who's likely going to retain their seat.
Yeah, I think actually we're we're probably pretty close on this, which maybe says something pretty powerful. The building block elements of campaigns, politics, message, money, masses, right? Those are sort of the three elements to think about it really in simplistic ways. But I think for those in Web3 and in crypto, I said earlier that the clay is still soft here. Some have described it as a pre-partisan environment, and that's eventually going to evolve. And I do think there is a window here to evolve from pre-partisan to actually bipartisan, which would make this one of the few issues in the entire country that could actually be bipartisan. And that is, to me, the opportunity that is in front of all of us right now. And so I would totally agree with Nikki's point, which is I would look at races that I was going to engage in that would either fall into a couple different categories. Are there primaries? So it's a D on D or an R on R, where maybe one candidate is perceived as really being pro-crypto and maybe the other isn't. I frankly don't think there's going to be that many of those types of races, but to the extent that there are, great if you want to get involved with those. I think better to spend time and effort on demonstrating to those folks who are going to be running this year that there are voters out there who really do matter. That means showing up at these town halls. That means raising money, particularly for incumbents. I forget what the last stat is, but well over 95% of incumbents get reelected. And thinking about who those incumbents are going to be that are going to be in. And this gets down to sort of tactical brass tacks, but this matters. Who's in leadership? Who is chairing which particular committees? Who's sitting on which particular subcommittees? And really beginning to think about that in a fairly sophisticated way in terms of who you're supporting and how you're thinking about it. Right, there are 3 open seats that are going to very likely go Republican. Missouri maybe because of some of the primary politics, but likely Wyoming, Oklahoma. Like those are 3 interesting areas to think about because there's going to almost by definition be a winner from one party and an opportunity to get in there early. And then really using the message piece of this, which is to really talk about why crypto does have a real impact on issues that those running for office should care about. But as Nikki has talked earlier, to do it in a way that actually an everyday person could be able to understand. Right, this is an opportunity to actually participate as an owner in our economy, for your labor to actually get rewarded in a more fair way. I mean, that's an argument that works. I'm more familiar with the left, but works on the left. A more transparent, a more accessible system. You shouldn't have to be paying enormous fees to even get access to the financial system. But actually communicating why this should matter. Again, I'm talking from the left or from a Democratic perspective right now, but why that should matter for someone who's running. And then I think there's going to be a couple races where there's some interesting folks who are running that would potentially be worth thinking about. You have a Pennsylvania Senate primary where you have someone who's very progressive, who has really begun to sort of look at crypto in an interesting way, the lieutenant governor. Former big Bernie Sanders supporter. Like you're beginning, John Fetterman. You're beginning to see. Excuse me.
Well, I forgot his name. It's
Fetterman, John Fetterman. Right, but you're beginning to see. I will share one story. I'm not going to say who it is because I don't want to violate any privileged conversations. But I was talking with someone who was running statewide, a Democratic side. They were sort of neutral, didn't really completely process what this represented. I shared with them that 1 in 10 voters are crypto. I also shared with them that 6 in 10 crypto holders voted for Joe Biden, and that it over-indexes on people of color, particularly Latino and Black voters. And so I put it on your next poll. This candidate put it on his next poll. It popped for all the obvious reasons. And again, without revealing too much, I think this is a candidate that has now really begun to talk comfortably and is embracing that social value proposition for Web3 because that person has now recognized that this actually is a winning political argument. Like, I actually think that if we can do some version of those town halls in August, and get candidates to start putting this on their polls, once they start to put this on their polls, the raw numbers are going to break through. And these are voters who do really care about this. And once that starts to get on their polls, that then translates into the politics here.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad that you brought up this issue, kind of, especially in the light of Democratic politics, because I was surprised to read the following in this recent Washington Post article. In the 2020 elections, crypto workers gave more than $730,000 in direct contributions to Democratic candidates and party committees, nearly 9 times what they donated to Republicans, according to an analysis by the Center for Responsive Politics. So this was fascinating to me because I'm sure you're well aware that there's this perception that the crypto industry is more closely aligned with Republicans. So do you have a sense of why there is this disconnect? Or is it just that there isn't a disconnect and Democrats just received more crypto donations because it was perceived that kind of Trump was losing power? And it was like a more cynical kind of donation where it's just, they were like, oh, the Democrats are rising in power, we should donate to them? Or
yeah, I mean, I'll jump in, and then Nikki, you should certainly share, obviously, your perspective. I think obviously there's always, that cynical element, right? And it's probably less cynical and more just the political reality of who's in power and who's in these leadership positions. But I do think it goes deeper than that. I do think that, as I said, 60% of crypto holders are Biden voters. So I think ideologically and philosophically, I think it's fairly well distributed. And so it should not be that surprising that people who began as Democrats are giving as Democrats. I also think there's a third thing going on here, which is there is a generation of Democrats. And there's a little bit of a generational divide, in the same way there is just a generational divide on Web3 writ large. But, you see a Cory Booker or a Richie Torres, congressman from New York. His district is adjacent to AOC's district. Senator Booker, really great senator from New Jersey. But both of them are forward-looking folks, but also both folks who really care about progressive arguments when it comes to economic participation for communities that have typically not been able to be full participants in the U.S. economy. They have come to it, through those issues. And not surprisingly, both of these guys are incredible retail politicians. Like Torres is in diners and walking through his neighborhood, every weekend. Cory lives, in these neighborhoods and spends time talking to people who talk about this, right? They actually have a real sense of it. Both Nikki and I have been in politics. I think one of the, in tech, they always talk about signals, right? A/B test signals. The signals for, at least in the Democratic side in politics, are where the mayors are, right? Because mayors tend to really be that first sort of early radar sign of issues, and it's really interesting.
Is a single issue voter? Is that what that means, or what does that mean?
By signal, I mean just like a political sign, like advanced radar. Like you're getting pings that there's issues out there. Signals. I'm sorry, I was mixing different definitions, but those mayors are picking up the power of this issue for their constituents. There's a reason in Eric Adams in New York, or Francis Suarez in Miami, mayor of Reno. I mean, urban mayors from smaller towns, they're all picking this up because they actually have a direct connection to their constituents and to their voters. And so I think there are reasons why you have seen that type of distribution of the contributions. And it's not just purely because the Democrats are currently in power. It is because their voters actually do care about this. And those signs and signals are being picked up by those elected officials, particularly the ones who are really talented.
Yeah, I have to say I'm a fan of Cory Booker because I have known him since I was 16. I did Stanford summer school and he was my RA. And even back then, you could tell he was very special. And I continue to think that.
So that's really funny. So my wife, who will kick me now, but she and Cory were at Stanford together and certainly friendly at Stanford. So you guys may have all overlapped. And I went to Amherst College with his twin brother, Kerry, who's really talented. So this is a Booker loving right now. But a preternaturally, I mean, when you first met him, like everyone, you immediately knew he had that sort of intangible quality.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating because, of course, now he's such a superstar. But even back then, when I was 16, we all knew there was something special and different about him.
But like any really smart, talented politician has the ability to, most politicians sort of follow where the voters are. Good politicians get a sense of where the voters are going. and sort of get there at about the same time. And really, really talented politicians get a sense of where those voters want to go, and it helps lead them to that place. And I think he and Torres, by the way, Richie Torres is incredibly talented as well. Both have, I think, that quality, and I think you're seeing that, and the reason why they've emerged as leaders on this.
So, Nikki, did you want to talk about whether or not there is this disconnect between this reality of kind of where crypto voters are politically versus the perception? Or
I would connect this to messaging, right, and storytelling instead of just necessarily the raw politics. And by the way, I know the mayors are for it, but it's also sexy. Like, it might be that their constituents are interested.
And then their notifications just blow up.
It's sexy. I'm waiting for Saturday Night Live to incorporate Bitcoin into Mayor Adams's next swagger sketch, because I do think it adds some, and not in a bad way. I mean, it's a cutting edge issue. Just showing familiarity with it is a smart political move. It's astute. But the three categories of voters I think are really important have to do with messaging and where I think there's an opportunity. One, which Chris mentioned these groups, but one is Latino voters, right? So if you have a diaspora community from El Salvador, people who are working here have paid taxes on their money and are sending it overseas to family and to relatives, they're paying a huge fee for that. That's a great use case for crypto. I think that's one story that should be told, and those are voters, Hispanic voters really, really matter to Democrats. Independent voters. So Chris mentioned Joe Biden voters being Democrats. I'm a Joe Biden voter. I'm not a Democrat. So I think you get independents who have sort of a centrist, light touch regulatory framework who are also really interested in having potentially some competition in the currencies that we can use. In my Cash App, I can choose dollars, I can choose Bitcoin. And that appeals to me as someone who has a little bit of a libertarian streak and an independence. And then I think the third are people who feel that, and because it is, that the financial system is rigged. So I've had to pay bail money for a relative. I'm not proud of that, but you're paying a huge fee to Western Union. They're not taking credit cards. And so if you've ever had to deal with bail bondsmen, with overdraft fees, with all of the ways that the system is rigged in a way that is more punitive to the people who can least afford to pay extra fees, that's another really good use case for this situation that also appeals to voters that Democrats don't want to lose. So I think if you start to tell real stories rather than theoretical stories, and you tie them to voting groups within the districts where people are running, that's a really effective, in my opinion, way to approach this midterm election. And Chris made a great point. We're in the thick of it. We have 4 or 5 months, and this is the moment to land that just right, because it is going to determine who's on committees and how they talk about this going forward.
Yeah, not to tag on two things you just prompted me as you were with your smart comments. The first, I think all the use cases Nikki described is right. I think it's really important that those founders and platforms and protocols that are out there that are doing some of this type of work, that they really demonstrate it in concrete ways, so that these are, we evolve from being aspirational to people seeing the actual utility. I do think amongst the things that's happened in the last 2 months, and I actually believe, have reason to believe, had a significant impact on the executive order, was people seeing the utility of crypto in Ukraine. The fact that $100+ million was, crypto dollars got into Ukraine almost instantaneously, more than the USAID was able to get in there in that same time period. The fact that Ukraine had a framework that they could actually use this, apply it, and then actually buy hardware and needed stuff in the moment. In fact, a company like Arweave created a way to be able to document in an immutable way, potential war crimes. All of those things happened, and people sort of saw the utility of that. So everything that Nikki described is 100% right, and how we think about elevating those founders and protocols, platforms that are actually doing this type of work, so people really see it. And even getting really smart and putting that into some of the districts and states on members who are going to really matter. Ohio and West Virginia are important states, when you start to think about, who's going to be making what decisions, off of the Hill. And then the last thing I will just say, if you're an elected official or wanting to run for office, most elected officials, particularly at the federal level, are coming from districts where the races are frankly won and lost in the primary. What's really interesting about crypto is it applies to both those folks running in primaries because they are one issue voters and it does really, evenly distributed more or less across political lines. But because they're also one issue voters in this much smaller subset of races that are genuinely really sort of competitive general election races, whether in the Senate or those House seats, these also end up being actual swing voters because they're going to vote on this issue, and it's 10% of the electorate. And so just like at the raw politics of this, it matters for the primary and it also matters in a general. And that's pretty unique for a subject, for a policy issue, which then goes to part of the political power that really exists here.
So many people on the left have been confounded by Elizabeth Warren's anti-crypto stance, since it's perceived that the Web3 ethos would be aligned with her kind of anti-big tech, anti-big bank platform. If you were to have a meeting with Elizabeth Warren today on crypto, how would you approach that discussion to try to persuade her of its merits?
Do you want me to take that, or Nikki?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have not had a conversation with her about this. I've been in rooms with her before and I've had conversations on other policy issues. And I would, begin with the predicate that she herself has identified. I don't think there has been, and to her credit, a more eloquent voice and a more powerful voice against both legacy gatekeepers and even some of the newer gatekeepers that exist, who have, created and contributed to a system where 10% of the country holds 80-something plus percent of the value of Wall Street. I mean, there are structural issues that have allowed that and will perpetuate that. She has talked about it. It is sort of the center of it's why she ran for office in the first place, and has been the center of her political philosophy and what she's all about, her organizing principle.
Yeah, so I know you haven't talked with her about this, but do you have a sense of why she...
Here's how I would then go to the conversation. Then I'll address why I think that exists. Obviously, I don't know. But and I think, really trying to have a dispassionate but logical conversation about the fact that, what Web3 represents is the ability to use technology to fundamentally disrupt for humans and not at the expense of humans, by actually allowing you to circumvent those historical structural blockers that exist. If there has not been a meaningful recalibration. Again, I'm talking from a left perspective, from an Elizabeth Warren perspective. There has not been a meaningful recalibration of the relationship between capital, labor, government, and society, really since the New Deal. And the New Deal was developed for an industrial age. We're in a digital age. And how do you recalibrate that to get the type of results that she wants? It is not going to be applying these old rules to this new thing. This is the biggest opportunity that has come along to fundamentally restructure that relationship, to provide and put in place and facilitate a more fair, a more open, a more just, a more equitable society. And I think walking her through that in a way that could be as dispassionate and logic-based and fact-based as possible, she is someone that does care about those issues. Now, the why, I think that, first of all, I think there's just generational aspects to this. I went through this with Airbnb. I'd walk into these congressional offices and I'd have this conversation and people say, it's really weird. Why would anyone ever want to rent, their house out? And then I would do two things. I would point out that probably at some point in their life, they had rented out a beach house or a lake house. It wasn't any different. And then they sort of think about that. And then I would say, let's ask your staff, right? And virtually every staff member raised their hand as being active users. And I would say, go ask your kids. And it would inevitably be that their kids were active users. I think there's a dynamic of that generational aspect that applies here. I would strongly suspect that there are people who are a younger generation who are Warren supporters who probably have a view that's very similar to the view that I'm expressing and espousing about the power here. And I also just think that that sort of the way that the politics are sort of being played here a little bit, and frankly, some of the and we talked about this at the very beginning, and Nikki I think was great on this. Some of the attacks that have come in have sort of pushed her, further and further to really dig in here. There was a hearing, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where you had, I think, the CEO of Chain Analysis, who was being asked, being asked a question about, whether there was any, evidence of money laundering and crypto being used, and he tried to answer the question, ultimately gave a really powerful answer, and to his credit, remained amazingly calm as he was consistently interrupted.
This afternoon, I would probably